What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Let's Talk MMA podcast. I hope you guys had a great holiday. And did you guys see that they want to do a UFC White House event? I thought it was a meme, but it turns out that the President Trump wants to put on a UFC event at the White House, and Dana is very interested. Him and Conor McGregor were talking about it. It's a crazy thing they're going to try to put together for next year. And it seems like somewhere around or even on the 4th of July of 2026 is when they want to do it. I'm not gonna lie, it does feel like a Family Guy episode, but it would be cool to see it. Although, it just doesn't seem real, like having a UFC event at the White House on the lawn outside. Are they going to build an arena? Because Dana doesn't like to have fights outside with no roof. So, they might build an arena for her or something. And is that the thing that gets Conor to fight again? He essentially called on Michael Chandler. And here we go, all over again, with Chandler waiting for Conor. And John Jones also is back in the testing pool. I don't know who he wants to fight, but he say he's going to keep his options open. And this is after Trump announced the UFC White House event. I don't even know what kind of card they could put together for that, but I'd imagine it would have to be stacked. That might be the biggest card in UFC history. There's going to be people who have never watched a UFC event. They're going to be watching that one just because it's at the White House. It's so wild to even think about that there's going to be a UFC event on the front lawn of the White House, and it's happening that quickly. Like, are we in a simulation? I never would have thought, ever, that the White House would be hosting a UFC event. The UFC wasn't even allowed in New York for so many years now. It wouldn't be a true White House event without an American champion. Well, okay, technically, we do have Killer Harrison. But the division's not that great. It's actually the worst division in the UFC. On the men's side, who could be the next American champion before we get to that event? There's always been a lot of American champions. And now, for like the first time ever, we don't even have one in the men's divisions. But who could the next one be? Honestly, man, I think Sean Brady has the best chance. I think he is the guy. If we look at heavyweight, the best American there is Curtis Blaydes, and he's not winning that title. For light heavyweights, Chloe Ray, he's the best American fighter there. Could he become champion? He has a better chance than Blaydes, but I don't think he beats Uncle. In the middleweight division, it's Sean Strickland, but after losing to Dreas twice, I don't think he becomes champ. Anthony Hernandez has a chance. He's very good. Welterweight, Sean Brady, can he become champ? Absolutely, man. That's America's guy right there, Sean Brady. At lightweight, the best American fighter is Max Holloway. Justin Gaethje is the highest ranked, but Max beat him at featherweight. The highest ranked is Brian Ortega, who is never winning that title for bantamweight, if we're not counting Morab, who also holds the American flag, sometimes if we don't count Morab. Then I guess Ali is the best American fighter there, or Corey Sandhagen. I don't think either winning that belt at flyweight. It could be Joshua Van, but he's from Myanmar, and he also doesn't seem to represent America either, like even the flag is not American. So it could be Bren Royval. I think Sean Bray is the best American fighter. And an interesting statistic, there are 5 Georgian fighters in the UFC, and 2 of them are champions. Isn't that crazy? There are a total of 5 Georgian fighters, and 2 of them are the best. One of them is the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the world. The other one's arguably the greatest bantamweight of all time. You also have Giga, Shakade, Roman Dietz, and Alexander Topuria. That is insane. And Alexander can go very far. I don't think Dietz or Shakade are going to go that far. But Alexander Topuria absolutely can. So, are Georgian fighters the best UFC fighters? Wait, what's their population? They have 3.7 million people in their country. Only 3.7 million. And they have like 2 of the best fighters in the world. That is the equivalent of the state of Connecticut in the United States. Connecticut has 3.6 million people. The country of Georgia has 3.7 million. Now, to be fair, Ilya does fight out of Spain. That's where he trains at. So it is slightly different. But that is kind of crazy, man. But does that beat Dagestan? Dagestan is 3.2 million. So, they beat Georgia in that. They also have 2 champions. Islam was a lightweight champion. Uncle I is also Dagestan vs. Georgia. Very interesting. Yoel Romero did say that Georgians beat Dagestanis in wrestling. Now it seems like they are the new rivalry in the UFC. There was Morov versus Umar, where Morov won. The Levers, where Imov won. And now Ilya wants to fight Islam. And these are the 2 best fighters in the world. There was the whole Dagestani versus Brazil thing, where so many of them were fighting each other. And the Dagestanis won most of the time, and it seems like that rivalry has shifted to the Dagestanis versus Georgians. As to currently which country is the best in the UFC, the UFC is on fire, and mostly because of one man, Ilya Topuria. Where it seemed like the sport was lacking in a lot of excitement, Ilya has just like spearheaded his career in front of everybody else's. He is like the focal point of the entertainment side of the UFC. Right now, alongside Islam. These two guys are seemingly in a two-man race as to who is the best fighter in the UFC. And eventually, that fight would have to happen, right? It would be a travesty if the UFC never has that fight. But it would need Islam to beat JDM, because if JDM beats Islam, it doesn't hit the same. These two guys have to be on the best win streaks when they fight each other. I know a lot of us throw around the term greatest a lot, but with no exaggeration, I believe Islam versus Ilia Topuria is the greatest fight in UFC history. They're the two most skilled fighters we've ever seen, arguably. I mean, there's like GSP and Khabib and Demetrius Johnson and fighters like that. But I would say, at least, it's the most skilled fight between two fighters we've ever seen. If Islam beats JDM, then it would be the first ever fight between two double champions. That has never happened before. Islam would have the longest win streak in UFC history, tied with Anderson Silva versus the three best win streak in UFC history from Ilia Topuria. A combined 33-fight win streak is insane between two fighters, and they're fighting at the highest level. There's no fight greater than this one. Number 1, pound for pound versus number 2, pound for pound. And Islam's been part of that fight before, when he fought Alexander Volkanovski, who at the time was a number 1 ranked fighter. He beat him twice, and he also beat the number 3 pound for pound Charles Oliveira. If he beats again the next number 1 ranked Ilia Topuria after winning a second belt against JDM, I mean, he might be the greatest fighter we've ever seen. Beating JDM and then Ilia, I think, makes Islam the greatest fighter of all time. There'll be 4 top 3 pound for pound wins for him, which has never been done before. Two-way world champion, longest win streak in UFC history. There'd be, like what? 7 title wins, and the level of competition at that point would be insane. Charles, Volk, twice, Dustin, JDM, and then Ilia. Forget about it, man. Islam's the greatest ever. But if Ilia beats Islam, could we say he's the greatest? I mean, that would indicate that he beats someone else first, right? Because as Islam's going to fight JDM, Ilia's going to fight somebody else. And hopefully, that's Arman, because and the Arman win is the next best win for his legacy. An Arman win is better than beating Paddy or Gaethje, because he's the number 1 contender and the next best guy. If he beats Paddy or if he beats Gaethje, it's not going to impact his legacy as much as if he beats Arman, right? Imagine Volk, Holloway, Oliveira, then Arman in a row. That hits way different than Paddy being at the end of that, or Gaethje being at the end of that. If he could beat Arman, and then fights Islam after, beats him, let's say, knocks out all these guys, as the way he usually wins. I mean, some people will say he's the greatest of all time, but I can see it. I can see it. The level of competition would eclipse every fighter. And honestly, at this point, man, all the legends and GOATs of the sport, their level of competition, it just doesn't really stack up the same way compared to guys like Ilan and Islam and various other fighters at the top like Volkanovski too, and Alexander Pantoja, and even Dryas. If we look at all the GOATs of the divisions, like Anderson Silva, right? The best guys Anderson beat were Dan Henderson and Vitor in the middleweight division. All the amazing fighters at the time. It falls off a cliff after that. Who's the next best guy he beat? I guess Rich Franklin. He does have the Derek Brunson win though, when Brunson was essentially in his prime and Anderson was washed, and he still beat him. Although a lot of people think Brunson should have won. Like compare that to Dryas. Dryas beat Israel Adesanya, Robert Whittaker, Sean Strickland. Twice. He also beat Derek Brunson, which is one of Anderson's best wins. Crazy enough. And it hurts to say, Anderson is one of my favorite fighters ever. He is the fighter that made me a fan of the sport. But I have to be honest, man, the guys that he beat just weren't that great, other than like 3. And those 3 do not even get close to the guys that Drake has beat. Not even close. Odyssey and Whittaker alone eclipses everybody Anderson's ever beat before. The one thing about Anderson though, he did go up to light heavyweight 3 times, all non-title fights. And you know the crazy thing about all 3 of Anderson's light heavyweight wins. James Irvin, Forrest Griffin, and Stephan Bonnar all failed their drug tests. James Irvin tested positive for methadone and oxymorphone. Stephan Bonnar tested positive for a bulinome metabolite. And as for Forrest Griffin, he tested positive for Xanax. He said he had a doctor's prescription for Xanax because he couldn't sleep the night before due to how nervous he was. Bro, that's how much fear Anderson put into his opponents, or at least a lot of them. Yeah, but if Drake beats Hamza, I think he's the greatest middleweight of all time. And it just goes to show that the legends that had the belts for such a long time, they just didn't have the same level of competition to the fighters that we have now. I think a lot of the legends, the GOATs of the divisions, like Anderson Silva and Joel Aldo, Demetrius Johnson and Dominic Cruz, and all these guys, right? I think, finally, most of them are being surpassed. And it's based off of one thing: quality versus quantity. When those guys were champions, it was like in the beginning of their divisions. The level of competition was not the same back then. And how could it be? It was really early in those weight classes when they were sorting themselves out more. That's why guys like Patrick, O'Tay, and Teleslatus got title shots against Anderson. And Demetrius Johnson fought Ray Borg and Wilson Hayes and John Moraga. And those guys is because that's all who were there. Driaz is not going to be defending his title against guys like Teleslata, Patrick O'Tay, and Travis Lutter. You know, Alexander Toya is not going to be fighting guys like John Moraga, Ray Borg, Chris Charasso, Wilson Hayes, and even guys like Tim Elliott. The division has way passed the level of Tim Elliott to be fighting for a title. I would say though, there are 3 legends that competition still stacks up to today. Those are John Jones, GSP, and Joe Aldo. The fact that Volk surpassed Joe Aldo is an amazing feat because Aldo beat some very good fighters. Now, the difference with Anderson Silva were his performances. He would have crazy knockouts and stuff. I think him as a fighter, just with his skills, not looking at his legacy, but just looking at his skills alone, Anderson can fight with the best of them of any era. He was that good. Now, that's not to say that the legends are always going to be worse than the next generation. That is actually not true. We can see with the light heavyweight division, Jones and DC's era was better than today's. The fighters then were more skilled, and you can even see it with boxing, for an example. The welterweight and middleweight divisions in the 80s are still regarded as some of the best boxers we've ever seen, with marvelous Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard, Thomas Hearns, Roberto Duran. Even when you compare them to today's boxers, they still stack up 40 years later. The reason why right now you can't do that for most divisions in the UFC is because the UFC started 32 years ago. We are still in one of the early stages of the UFC after like 70 years. It's not going to be as much of a difference between different eras. But right now, I mean, we're seeing styles and skills evolve in front of our eyes. That's how much better the fighters are getting. Even like 10 years ago, there were one-dimensional fighters fighting for titles. The calf kick alone was wreaking havoc across the sport. Like specific techniques alone are changing the game. Whereas in boxing, that rarely ever happens anymore. Right, because boxing has been around for over 100 years. And I guarantee it, like 70 years from now, Anderson Silva, Dominic Cruz, Demetrius Johnson, Joel Aldo, even George Est appear. These are all going to be looked at as the pioneers of the sport. Perhaps like the same way we look at Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis, maybe even earlier than that. You know, maybe we look at them like boxers look at John L. Sullivan or something. You know, it's hard to imagine GSP would eventually be like greatly surpassed in skill in any point in the future. Right. Because of how good he was. But I can't imagine people thought the same thing about Joe Louis or Sugar Robinson when they were fighting in their prime. Not to say that they're equivalent in skill or whatever it is. It's like a similar concept. Like GSP is the best we have. He is a lot of people's GOAT of the sport, the highest expression of skill in MMA. To see him eventually get surpassed in the future is very hard to imagine up until it does, right? And I can imagine it was the same thing when Sheree Robinson was the best of his sport, the pound-for-pound #1 boxer in the world when he was in his prime. I can imagine people thought the same thing, like there's no way any boxer is ever going to be better than this guy. But it eventually will. Like fighters will get a lot better than GSP because Alelia says it all the time that he is the next generation. He is the guy who's evolving the sport. But there's going to be another player into this that's going to evolve the sport even past that. That is so interesting. That is so interesting, and what that looks like. What is the next level after Elia? Fighters are going to be so well-rounded that the techniques are going to be better than they've ever been before. And I was looking at other fighters' opinions of Elia, like how good this guy is. Every fighter says, outside of his weight class, that want to fight against him. Everybody else who's indirect of Ilia Topuria say he's like the best boxer they've ever seen in the sport. His mentality is different. It's like Muhammad Ali. Like, I even heard Dana say that I've heard Rampage Jackson say the same thing, like the perception that Elia gets out of former champions and legends of the sport is that of, like high greatness, he is truly evolving the game, just like he said he was going to. There was always a narrative that boxing was like one of the most important aspects of MMA. Elia is showing why that is. I mean, this guy hasn't even thrown a single body and head kick in his entire UFC career. He does have good calf kicks. He's a good wrestler. He has good jiu-jitsu, good top pressure, and all of that. But his striking is mostly revolved around boxing, mastering the boxing fundamentals specifically for the sport of MMA, right? Because, of course, he would be boxing different in the sport of boxing compared to this one. And even against Charles, like you see Charles trying to take him to the ground, which worked very well against Chandler. Chandler's a good wrestler. He's big and strong there. Easily wrestled Chandler to the ground multiple times in their fight. When he tried the same move on Ilia Topuria, it got easily defended, and he ended up with his back on the ground. When he tried to get on top, his purpose of that takedown was to get on top of Ilia, but he found himself on his back. Couldn't secure any of the submissions. He was going for the leg lock, which honestly doesn't work that well in MMA. These guys have to stop going for leg locks. Charles does it slightly different than others, where he's just trying to scramble his opponent and try to get something off of that. Not necessarily submitting him with the leg lock, but maybe trying to get a better position off of it and not letting his opponent to get away from him as he wants them on the ground. But even Ilya punched him in the face to get out of it. The best defense to a leg lock is ground and pound. We've seen so many fighters get code because they were going for leg locks. Do you know one of the best uses of attacking the legs off your back is how Brennan Moreno tripped out Davis and Figueroa? I think it was in their last fight or the second last fight. Insane, they fought 4 times, but he kicked out his legs, grabbed the heel, tripped him on the ground, and then stood up. He didn't attack the legs with a submission, but he attacked the legs in order to stand up. That's much better use of using leg locks and stuff like that. And this whole leg lock mistake is also reflected in street fights. As soon as ground and pound is added into a fight, leg locks lose their efficiency. And overall, for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's just not looked at as the same effectiveness as it used to be. I think the sports avenue that it took, even before with karate and boxing and all these different martial arts, whenever money got involved, it turned to sport. And that seems to represent the martial art right. What you see in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tournaments where guys are pulling guard and going for leg locks and stuff, not the most effective thing to do in a street fight. But then again, they're not always entirely supposed to be self-defense, right? The sports part of it is not supposed to be self-defense, right? Those are not the same things because you're not pulling guard in a self-defense situation. You're not throwing Ianari rolls in a street fighting situation. I would say, in a street fight, that boxing and wrestling are the most important to learn in an unarmed scenario. In a street fight scenario, I would say boxing and wrestling are the most important to learn. Muay Thai can be excellent, but you want to stay grounded. Fast, swift strikes to knock the other guy out, and wrestling, so you don't get taken to the ground, as most street fights end up on the ground, and you can control that if you know wrestling. So you can keep the fight standing, or even slam them on the concrete, knock them out with your boxing. Those are the 2 best things to learn. It doesn't even seem like just in street fighting, but also in MMA, which is very interesting. Because MMA is almost like a simulated street fight with a few rules, right? But for both scenarios, street fighting and MMA, a mix of boxing and wrestling usually seems to be the most effective. And speaking of wrestling, you guys see that bone. Nichols taking part of a Hulk Hogan's wrestling promotion. It's called Real American Freestyle. And apparently, it's an unscripted freestyle and folk-style promotion for wrestling matches. Does he not care to get better for MMA? The wrestling match is on August 30th, which means he's most likely shifted his focus on getting ready for that instead of improving his MMA skills. Near 2 months is a lot of time wasted by not focusing on getting better. It's possible that he can have his focus on both, but it doesn't seem like the most practical thing, especially coming off a loss like that. And it brings up the question about how hungry is he to be the best fighter possible. Most fighters who are highly competitive are going to be thinking about getting better in this sport, not something else. Especially when you're as new to MMA as Bo Nickel is. Does he not care to get better for MMA, and he just wants to return to wrestling because the wrestling match is on August 30th, and he's most likely shifted his focus on getting ready for that instead of improving his MMA skills? Near 2 months is a lot of time wasted by not focusing on getting better at his profession. But again, which is his profession? Is it a return to wrestling, or is it an MMA? Because trying to do both, especially coming off a loss where his overall skills are lacking in a lot of areas, both in the striking and in the grappling, right? It's the same guy who couldn't take down Jamie Pickett without a low blow. Some of his wrestling efforts were defended against by Cody Brundage, who's only a decent enough wrestler. Returning to the sport where he's formed his skills hasn't been super impressive in MMA, and it doesn't seem like returning to that is going to be the thing that gets him better in MM. It could be that he just doesn't care, or maybe RDR broke his mental with that loss, because you'd expect any highly competitive athlete to be obsessed with getting a win back after losing that badly. I can't imagine any other fighter who has high aspirations in this sport to go do something else, shift their focus from winning their next fight, right? Even Sean Malley did some grappling matches after losing to Chato, but he truly didn't believe that he got beat by the better fighter. Bo Nickel can't use that same excuse, as he got destroyed easily by a better fighter. But again, Bo maybe just doesn't care that much. He's probably getting paid good money to wrestle, which is great for him if that's the avenue he takes for his career. But if he returns to MMA, I am not confident for his next fight. Like, for an example, he talked a lot about Hamza, right? He said he was going to beat Hamza, all that stuff. If Hamzat lost in like his 4th UFC fight, I could not imagine he would go to wrestling or something like that. He did it against Jack Hermanson, but he was winning. He was undefeated. People believed he was the best in the world. He was an inevitable champion. So, of course, it was a very different scenario with Hamza. But if he actually lost the same way Bo Nickel did, let's say Li Jingliang TKO with a knee to the body or something like that. I could not imagine someone like Hamza would be focusing on wrestling after that. No, he'd be getting better as an MMA fighter, and that would be his sole focus. Just like many other fighters in the sport who have lost, like Peyton Talbot. Peyton Talbot got out-wrestled by Honey Barcelos for the first loss of his entire career, and he didn't focus on going into wrestling matches and stuff like that. No, he got better in the gym. He stayed in the gym, focused on MMA, and those improvements in his wrestling got him the win against Philippe Lima. Bon Nickel loses, and not because of his wrestling was inefficient. He lost because of a deficiency in his striking against Ryan Derrida. And he goes to wrestle. When wrestlers transition to MMA, there's like a grace period where they have to unlearn a lot of bad habits, right? Chael Sonnen has talked about this before because a lot of the techniques in wrestling are not good for MMA. They can get you submitted, ground and pound shots, all that sort of stuff which are absent in that sport. So instead of unlearning a lot of those habits, Bon Nickel is going to return to wrestling and relearn the habits again, or strengthen those habits, because he needs to win those wrestling matches. And probably he doesn't think that he can get better as an MMA fighter, so might as well just focus on wrestling or something. Though, I don't know, man. I want to see Bo Nichol get better. But now that he's focusing on wrestling, I have no confidence in him winning his next fight. And you guys see Tom Aspinall says he has a fight and he wants to fight 4 times in a year with the state of the heavyweight division. How fast he wins. Why not 4 fights in one night? I think he can get it done. I think he could be for top contenders within a week. Maybe not in a single day. It's great that the heavyweight division could finally move on from the plague that was the John Jones era of that division. And the UFC is also looking to sign Buxa, who is one of the best heavyweight grapplers in the world. He was fighting at 1. He's 5-1 in MMA, and they're saying that the UFC wants to sign him. So that's another potential future opponent for Tom Aspinall, because man, that division is lacking big time. So he's probably going to be fighting Silgong next, if I had to guess. He'll eventually fight Volkov. He'll eventually fight Almeida and Acosta. He'll beat all of them easily. Torreira might be able to knock out Derek Lewis, and they get one more win, knocking out, let's say, Curtis Blades or something, and get a title shot afterward. Is he the guy that could beat, or at least fight, with Tom Aspinall? Who knows? But I don't think anybody can. I don't think anybody, currently a heavyweight, could beat Tom Aspinall. And he's looking to do exactly what Pantoja is doing. Beat everybody in the division. And I think he can do it. Now the question is, how far away is he from becoming the greatest heavyweight of all time, with the whole quality versus quantity thing. He's never going to have the same quality of wins as Stipe had. With all the current fighters at heavyweight, right? He's not going to be able to fight guys like Francis Ngannou unless Ngannou does return to the UFC. That would be very different. But most likely, he's not fighting guys like Francis Ngannou, Daniel Cormier, or Friso Verdum. All those guys in their prime, right? Fighters with that status. Gane and Volkov are good wins for a heavyweight, but it still doesn't stack up to the quality that Stipe had. So the only way Tom Aspinall is ever going to become the greatest heavyweight of all time is if he eclipses all of the stats that Stipe had. So, 3 title defenses in a row, 4 overall, are going to have to be eclipsed. Aspinall is going to need like 7 title defenses or something like that to be the GOAT. And if he fights 4 times a year, he can literally do that in less than 2 years. I cannot wait for the Tom Aspinall era. But let's go to the questions. We're going to start with Rab. Hi, Weasel. Thanks for the content. This is my favorite MMA channel by far. Thank you so much, man. I think John Silva matches up against all the top guys at featherweight. And do you think he might be another Ilya level fighter? Also, do you think some weight classes produce better fighters than the rest? Ilya's rise, resembling Conor's, got me thinking how many great fighters come up at featherweight like Volk, Max, Aldo, Charles, Dustin, Sabit, if he stuck around. Thanks again. No problem, man. Thank you so much for the question. So, John Saver versus the top 5 of the featherweight division. I would say he beats Arnold Allen, Y. Rodriguez, Diego Lopez. Moser loses to Max and then beats Vogue, but Max is not at featherweight anymore. So, if we count him Brian Ortega, he would easily destroy Brian Ortega. And comparing him to Ilya Topuria, I wouldn't say he's as good as Ilya, but he's part of that new generation. A very good striker with great takedown defense and a powerful striker. So, he does have some similarities in that sense, where even the way he stands, like he's very grounded, with a lot of strikes that he throws, and he sits on his punches very well with amazing timing on his shots. So, I would say yes, he's part of the new generation, which is the next level. And that's why I think he beats Vogue, but he's not as good as Ilya specifically, and the only reason I think Max beats him is because of the durability. If it's still there. If his chin didn't get destroyed by Ilya, and he has a 5-round cardio, very good striker, all of that. I don't know how good John Silva's cardio is, but I don't think he can keep up with Max's pace. And I think that's what wins Max the fight. And now, your second question. Do some weight classes produce better fighters than the rest? Yes, I believe. Historically, if you look at from the beginning of the UFC till now, the featherweight division has produced the best fighters overall. We could just represent the weight class with the champions, starting with Jose Aldo, right? Or even if we start with the WEC with Uriah Faber and Mike Brown, you go to Joel Aldo, Conor McGregor, Max Holloway, Alexander Volkanovski, and Ilia Topuria. All of those fighters are elite. Every single one of them. Brown and Faber are definitely the worst out of those, but they were very good fighters for their era. And going from Aldo to Ilia, these are some of the most skilled fighters we've ever seen in the sport. And they're all from the same weight class, right? You can't say the same thing for every other division. Every other division had champions who weren't as good. In heavyweight, we had Andrei Arlovsky and Tim Sylvia. At light heavyweight, we had Jamal Hill. At middleweight, we had Michael Bisping. You know, no disrespect to Michael Bisping, but come on, you know? Like that's not on the level of the featherweight champions. Every single one of those guys were great. At welterweight, we had Matt Serra at one point. Someone say, now, Leon Edwards. I still think Leon's a very good fighter, but I think now he's underrated with how many people think he's not that good. He had flukish wins and stuff like that. I would say, if he never beat Usman twice, then yes, that one win against Usman would have been a fluke. If you beat Usman, you're an elite fighter. And then in the lightweight division, at lightweight, they had Anthony Pettis, who was a good fighter, but not on the same level as those featherweights. In the bantamweight division, they had Shauna Ali, right? And at flyweight, well, flyweight had actually all very good champions. I would say flyweight has some of the best champions out of any other weight class, too. So, flyweight to featherweight, I would say, have the best history of champions out of any weight class, but featherweight being the best out of them. There's been no other division with more successful fighters who moved up than the featherweight division. There's been so many featherweights who beat some of the best lightweights in the world when they moved up into that weight class. Max Holloway, Conor McGregor, Charles Oliveira, Dustin Poirier, Don Hooker, Ilia Topuria. That division has had the most success of fighters moving up than any other division. So, excellent question, man. And then, Susan Top. Why do you use Khabib as a backdrop in your prediction videos? Any specific reason? Well, it was originally Conor because the whole Mystic Mac thing. But when Khabib beat Conor, then I changed it to Khabib. So, I kept it as Khabib until he loses, and he never lost. And during that time is when my channel grew a lot, and people just were familiar with my prediction videos with Khabib as a thumbnail. So, I just kept it, even after he retired. I have changed it before with other fighters. But it's more of like an algorithm thing, where I don't want people to skip over the video because I don't have Habib on it. So that's why. So it's pretty much become like the thumbnail. Then your second question, who is that one fighter in each division who will represent the next generation of mixed martial artists, just like Ilya did? I mean, I guess, technically, they're not the next generation. They are the current generation, right? And same goes with Ilya. Like these guys are the current generation, which has just begun. In the heavyweight division is Tom Aspinall. And honestly, there's like nobody else who represents the evolution of the sport better than Tom for that division. Sorrel down with his striking and footwork is definitely on the next level. But he doesn't have the grappling. And you need well-rounded fighters to represent the next generation. For the light heavyweight division, I would say it's Uncle. For the middleweight division, I would say Hamza. But he's not as well-rounded as I would say Imov and Bayar. Hamza is more of an anomaly, where most fighters are not going to fight like him. So he wouldn't be the best representative for the general fighter due to how unique his style is. And Durkis is one of a kind. There will never be anyone who fights like him and have success. Most who try to fight like Dryas would never get into the UFC. It only works for him. And I guess Reiner Derater somehow. So I would think Imov and Bahayo represent the next generation better than even Hamza and Dryas, because those two are good at everything. They can wrestle, they can grapple, they have good cardio, they're technical, they're as well-rounded as it comes for a middleweight. For the welterweight division, I would say Sean Brady, a lightweight. It's Ilya, a featherweight. I would say John Silva. But I would say Arnold Allen, Lauren Murphy, and Wisov Zell are a better representative of what it is to be a well-rounded fighter, even more than Silva. So even though I think John Silva is the best fighter in that division, he's not necessarily as well-rounded, right? He's a striker who could defend takedowns. He doesn't necessarily wrestle offensively, go for submissions, or anything like that. Alan Murphy and Zell will attack and defend in a well-rounded fashion. For bantamweight, I would say it's both Morab and Umar. But I guess Morab is not the next generation. Umar would be that. So for bantamweight, it's Umar. He's eventually going to be champion. And then for the flyweight division, it's interesting because Joshua Van is obviously the next generation, right? If he doesn't beat Pantosia, he's eventually going to be champion at some point in his career. But he's very similar to like a John Silva. He's a striker who will just defend takedowns. He's not going to wrestle offensively, go for submissions or anything like that. he's going to strike and try to knock you out. But I guess Ramadan Timurov is the most well-rounded of the next generation. So I think he represents it the best. And then for the women divisions, I would say because they are behind, so they don't have to be well-rounded, okay? So I would say Norma Dumont. And then for flyweight is Jasmine, just a viscous. She's actually very good everywhere. And then for the strawweights, none of them. While there is no one in the rankings that stands out. Yeah, I don't know if strawweight is going to have like a next generation that surpasses Jean Lee. The next era for straw might be even worse than the current era. Then, your third question. Do you think Ilya levels or breaks Islam's tunnel defense in lightweight? No, not because he can't, but because I don't think he cares to. Ilya said a while ago that he's not going to be fighting for that long, and he's just there for the biggest fights, right? He wants to fight the biggest fighters now. That is just speculative. I don't really think he cares to do that. But if he does, like if that is a goal of his, then yes. Besides Islam and Arman, I think he beats everybody else easily, right? So, if he fights Arman Sarukin in a close fight, but beats him, then he knocks out Justin Gaethje, knocks out Paddy Pimblett, and submits Dan Hooker. Then he level Islam's title defenses. And honestly, can you see him doing that? Do you think he beats Arman Gate, Paddy, and Hooker? I think so. Besides Arman, all those other fights are easy for him. Keep up the good work, brother. Thank you so much for the questions, man. And then, we got to Yale Castro, that greatest gatekeeper in every division of all time. Interesting question. A heavyweight. The ultimate gatekeeper at heavyweight, I would say, is if you're a champion. You can't necessarily be a gatekeeper, because I was going to say Andrei Arlovsky, but he was a champion before. You know what? Travis Brown. Travis Brown is the ultimate gatekeeper, right? And just to define it, making it easier, a gatekeeper is someone who's never been champion, never fought for the belt, and pretty much is the guy that, if you beat them, then you become one of the best, or like a top-ranked fighter, right? And I think that would be Travis Brown for the heavyweight division. For light heavyweight, there's a few fighters, but I would say it's either Alexander Rokek or Ryan Bader. One of them, too. Ryan Bader, the easiest fight in the weight class. Dude, that was the best DC moment of all time. I want the easiest fight. I want Ryan Bader for middleweight. Brunson might be the best gatekeeper in UFC history. And so many fighters got title shots off beating him, or fought other top contenders because they beat him. It's insane. The guy fought Yoel Romero, Robert Whittaker, Anderson Silva, Posse's prime. Jacare, Otto Snogna, Cannonier, Dryas, the Mans. Literally fought the best middleweights of all time and never fought for the belt. Now for welterweight, I would say it's probably Neil Magny or Jeff Neal. Neil Magny more, because he's been there for so long. And it's crazy that Magny beat Jeff Neal. So yes, I would say Neil Magny is the gatekeeper of the welterweight division. For lightweight, it definitely was Donald Cerrone until he fought for a belt. But I would say it's Dan Hooker. 3 fighters got a title shot after beating him. Islam Makhachev, Michael Chandler, and Dustin Poirier. And Edson Barba was 1 win away from fighting for a title after he beat Hooker, too. So yeah, I would say Dan Hooker is the best gatekeeper in lightweight history. For featherweight, I would have said Josh EMTT, but he did fight for an interim title. Honestly, it might be Dan E. If you could beat Dan E, you're eventually going to make it to the top of a division, right? Kelvin Keeter made it to the top 5 after beating him. Korean Zombie fought for a title. Josh EMT fought for interim title. Moore's in the top 5 and should be fighting for a title. Diego Lopez fought for a title. Laurel Murphy's on his way up. So I would say Don Ige, even though he's always been at the lower end of the rankings, I would say he's the best featherweight gatekeeper. Then for the bantamweight division, easily Rob Font. Then for the flyweight division, the best gatekeeper is probably Dustin Ortiz. Then for the women's bantamweight division, maybe it's Jana Santos. For the women's flyweight division, I would say Vivian Arjo. And then for strawweight, it's Tisha Pennington. But great question, man. They're going to Felipa Arroyo. Best fighters in each division that never fought for a UFC belt. With wins over Gong Pavlovich, Overeem, and Verdum, I think Volov should be on the list. For the heavyweight division, you could say it's Volov, especially because he beat Pavlovich. The Gon fight, even though he should have won, Gon did get the decision. But it can't be Gon, because Gon was an interim champion, and he fought for the undisputed title. So, but even still, yeah, I would say it's Alexander Volkov. I can't think of any other heavyweight that's better than him who never fought for a title. And light heavyweight, it might be Carl Berg. Technically, he hasn't fought for a title yet. And I can't think of another light heavyweight that's better than him, who never fought for a belt. Maybe Ryan Bader, but I can see old Berg beating him. So, I would say Berg. At middleweight, it's Hamza Shameh, but since he is fighting for the belt, I would say it's Giger Mousasi, who was arguably the next title challenger if he didn't leave the UFC. At welterweight, I would say it's Sean Brady. At lightweight, it's Arman Sarukin. At featherweight, I would say Makhachev. At bantamweight, easily Corey Sanhagen, and at flyweight, I think it was John Lucker, even though he made weight just as much as he missed weight for that division. But yeah, I would say John Lucker. At women's bantamweight, it's Norma Dumont. At women's flyweight, Natalia Silva, and a strawweight, Vera Yanroba. Pretty much the top contenders of those weight classes currently. Then we go to Devil's Crypt. During UFC 254, Khabib was set to fight Gaki and Islam. Makhachev was originally scheduled to fight Hava Dos Anjos, but that fight got cancelled due to RDA testing positive for COVID. Khabib then publicly challenged Michael Chandler to step in and fight Makhachev, saying that if Chandler won, he'd get the next title shot. My question is, if Michael Chandler had accepted that challenge and ended up beating Islam Makhachev, do you think that could have changed the course of history, possibly even causing Khabib to delay or reconsider his retirement, since Khabib was a man of his word? Could Chandler's decision to not step in have actually played a role in Khabib retiring that night after beating Gaethje? Very interesting question. To keep Khabib in the game, but it would have put a lot of pressure on Khabib to do so. Now, yes, Khabib is a man of his word. He gave his mom his word that he would never fight again. So, I don't think Khabib would have fought, but there might have been some regret there if he didn't fight Chandler in that scenario, right? Because how can you not fight the guy that you told him to stop him and fight? Islam believing that Islam would beat him, and Chandler defeats Islam, calling Khabib out, cause you know for a fact that if Chandler defeated Islam, he would call a Khabib. He'll cut a promo on the mic, call Khabib out, and make the fight as big as possible. And at that time, Chandler was in his prime. That was right after he beat Dan Hooker. Chandler started to fade off after the Charles Oliveira fight, right? Arguably, that was the last prime Michael Chandler was in the first fight against Charles Oliveira. So instead of that fight ever happening, he steps up to fight Islam Makhachev, beats him, cuts the promo on the mic. The UFC pressuring Khabib to throw all the money at him. I could see Khabib taking that fight. Perhaps not because of the money, but because he asked Chandler to step up and Chandler beats Islam, right? That would be the pressure right there. Now, of course, that would most likely never happen, right? I don't see Michael Chandler beating Islam Makhachev at all. Unless he did like a brain transfusion and gave him GSP's brain, then that would be different, right? If Chandler had like Volk's brain or GSP's brain, he might be the best fighter we've ever seen. But because he fights like Chandler, I don't think he would ever beat in Islam. But in the scenario that he does, Because any fighter can win, I would not be surprised if Khabib stuck around and fought Michael Chandler for his last fight. For Khabib and his own legacy, I don't think he would have stuck around. But for his friends, that would have been the best way. Khabib would have taken one more fight, and he would have slaughtered Michael Chandler out there. I don't think he would have stuck around. But that would have been the scenario that could have got another fight out of him than anything else. Great question, man. Who has the best chances of beating Ilia Topuria from 145 to 170? So, Ilia is not a big lightweight, which would mean he'd be very small for the welterweights. I think JDM would beat him. I think Bal would beat him. I think Sean Brady would beat him. Shavikot. Would Leon beat Ilia? I think so. Usman right now. Yes. I think his wrestling would be too strong. Usman striking is definitely not as good as it was, but his wrestling is still very strong, and I think good enough to beat not only Ilia Topuria, but some of the other best welterweights too, as shown in his Buckley fight. I think Ian Gary wins. Michael Morales. Yeah. It just looks like the size of the welterweights would be too much. So, I'll look at lightweight and down, including Islam. First, I would say Islam Makhachev. Then, number 2. Then, I would say Dustin Poirier, and them. 2 are far above the rest, stylistically. Dustin is the only guy that can box with them and land some good shots on Ilia. Nobody else can, besides. Maybe, I guess John Silva. I think John Silva has a decent chance at winning, too. But I would say it goes Islam Makhachev, Justin Poirier, John Silva, Arman Sarukian, Moser, Evov, Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway, Diego Lopez, Justin Gaethje, Arnold Ellen, and then Yaya Rodriguez. And no, I don't think Paddy has that much of a chance of beating Ilia, even though that's like the hyped up fight. I think would actually be one of the easiest fights in Ilia's career. Ilia would be landing home run shots on that chin until he's knocked out. He doesn't have the striking defense. He doesn't move his head. He's flat-footed. He doesn't have the takedowns to get Ilia to the ground. Even if they are on the ground, Eli will stand up eventually, just like he did against Charles. All Paddy has are the head kicks and a puncher's chance, and that's it. And that's not going to be as difficult for Eli than even someone like Justin Gaethje, who can land leg kicks, who has better hands, faster with some of his strikes, and hits harder. I think Ilia Topuria would knock Paddy Pimble out viciously in the first round, and the fight would not even be close up until that point. Styles make fights like Paddy could beat Justin Gaethje. he could beat Dan, Hooker, and some of these other guys who don't have necessarily like great ground games when he doesn't have that same advantage over Ilya. And I can't see Paddy outstriking Ilya other than landing some head kick. But Paddy just isn't as fast with the strikes. So I can see Ilya blocking the head kicks and using those to enter into the pocket with body shots and then going to the head with an overhand KOing him. A lot of people talk about the size and power of Paddy Pimblett, but you don't beat guys on Il's level because you're just bigger than him. You have to also be highly skilled. Even when I was talking about the welterweights, that they're all bigger than him, they're all very skilled too. Like, they all have advantages, not just in attributes, but also in their skill sets, right? JDM can strike with Ilya the entire fight. He's one of the best strikers in the UFC, too. He has great takedown defense, excellent switch striker with very good combination. Sean Brady can take him to the ground and has some of the best grappling. In the UFC, Shafka Rahman, very well-rounded, can take the fight to the ground. He has great offensive striking, too. I think the hype of Ilya versus Paddy, because of the trash talk and all that stuff, is creating like a smokescreen on what that fight actually looks like. So, that's my take on that fight. I don't think Paddy Pimblett gives Ilia Topuria much of a fight. But, great question, man. They would. A goose said top fighters where a fighter lost his prime. For an example, Tony vs. Justin, where deep down we knew it was the end. So Tony Ferguson versus Justin Guy is definitely the first one most people think of. Henbrel versus TJ Dillashaw is the other. Cody Garbrandt versus TJ Dillashaw, which is crazy. TJ pretty much ended to fighters. Marlon Morris versus Henry Cejudo. Morris was never the same after the Kudo fight. It's crazy how good he was up until that fight where he beat John Dodson, knocked Aljamain Sterling out in the first round, knocked out Jimmy Rivera in the first round, who at the time was one of the top contenders. Venge's loss to Rafael Sunsao. In the first round, 3 first-round finishes against top-notch bantamweights. Goes into the Cejudo fight, wins the first round, beating Sudo's legs up. Sudo adjusts to the fight, switches up the game plan, and broke Morris's will to the point where he was never the same after Vitor Belfort versus Chris Weidman. Not because Chris Weidman won, but that was the end of TRT for Vitor, which changed them forever. TRT was allowed, right? But it shouldn't have been. And to be fair to Vitor, when they stopped allowing TRT, he got off of it. Fought for the title, lost to Chris Weidman, was obviously not in the gear anymore. You can see how his body deflated, and then just got knocked up multiple times in his next several fights. Crazy. Luke Rockhold versus Michael Bisping. Luke Rockhold was never the same after he lost to Michael Bisping. Which is crazy to think about, that Bisping was the guy who cracked Luke Rock's chin, because the fight after that, he fought David Branch, and he also got hurt by David Branch, who wasn't a big puncher. Then Romero knocked him out. Then Blachowicz knocked him out. That him and Paula had a war, and Rockhold's chin was a lot better before that. Even when Vitor's spinning heel kicked him, he got dropped, but not KO'd from that shot. Rockhold, after the Bisping fight, would have been KO'd from that shot. But when he actually fought Vitor, it was a ground and pound after that knocked him out. He was still somewhat conscious after taking a spinning heel kick to the face, which is impressive for Luke Rock. Another one was Chuck Liddell when he fought Rampage Jackson. When Rampage knocked him out, Chuck Liddell was never the same. He lost to the Dean of Mean, Keith Jardine, in his next fight. Idea how insane that is for Chuck Liddell. Going from his prime, beating Randy Couture twice, Tito Ortiz, to losing at Keith Jardine. Then he had the fight with Vanderlei Silva, which was an excellent fight. Then went on a 4-fight loss streak, all knockouts. Rashad, Shogun, Franklin, and then much later, Tito Ortiz, all knocked him out. And the thing was, Chuckle's defense was all about his chin. He used to eat punches like Tic Tacs until Rampage landed that right hook to the chin and KO'd him. Chuckle just could not beat Rampage Jackson. He got finished by him in Pride, and then finished again in the UFC. Then we're going to Prince Malcolm. Thoughts on Benison Insurance wanting to 107 him and refusing to help cover his medical expenses. Thanks, Weasel. Love the content. No problem, man. Thank you so much. And so, Ben Askren did get the double lung transplant, but the guy has insurance. Right. So why isn't it helping the most crucial medical procedure of his life? I don't understand that. Is it the medical system? Did he not have the proper health insurance for the procedure? But then again, shouldn't his health insurance cover that in general? I don't understand the health insurance and how it's structured, but there's something definitely wrong. If Ben Askren's medical insurance is not covering his lung transplant, then we go to Isaac Badar Viterd. Which fighters had or have the best fighting style for outside the cage? And Islam versus Topuria, early prediction. So, who has the best fighting style for essentially a street fight? Ilia Topuria. He has the most effective fighting style on the streets. You can't take him to the ground. Hands. You don't want to be throwing hands with Ilia. How do you fight this guy? Right? You throw a kick and get knocked off balance. You don't want to be on your back in a street fight. It's crazy that the best street fighting style in the UFC is also the #1 ranked fighter in the world in the sport with other fighters. Dustin Poirier is another one. Rampage Jackson getting slammed on concrete. Fedor Emelianenko, a lot of fighters with that general style where it's focused a lot on boxing and fast hands, good takedown defense, and strong offensive wrestling if they need to use it. Those are going to be the best fighting styles for street fights. And Islam versus Topuria. I think Islam wins. I think his wrestling would be the difference maker in that fight. He has good counter-strike and good high kicks, decently fast strikes, and good footwork, too. He was able to cut a few angles on Dustin Poirier to land his combinations. And he's also very good in the clinch. Even mixes in his combos with the Thai plum. Islam's striking was at his best when he fought Dustin. I think a lot of that stuff could also work against Ilya. But I don't think he dominates. I don't think it's a one-sided fight. I think it's very close where both fighters can win. But I think Islam has a slight advantage against Ilya if I gets into his range. The only thing I can see Islam countering with is the clinch. But he would have to grab onto that very quickly because Ella is going to be ripping shots of the body and try to knock him out. I don't think Islam is going to have the most success if Ilya's pressuring him. Islam will have to be the one pressuring Ilya, and that's probably the best way for everybody to fight Ilya. They have to pressure him. He can fight on the back foot, but he's not as good. Like he was countering Josh EMTT on the back foot with very good technique, but it caused him to constantly explode. And can he do the same when the other guy's wrestling with his pressure? That's why I think Khabib is a worse matchup for Ilya than Islam is. And speaking of that fight, we go to Trey J. Sway. What would Ilya Topuria versus Khabib Nurmagomedov be? Like, I need a full breakdown. No bias, please. Again, I can see both guys winning, but I think the pressure with the wrestling could be a kryptonite for Ilya. We don't know, though. We haven't really seen him go up against a fighter like that, and Khabib is the best fighter at that. I can't see the counter-punching that he did against Josh EMTT being as effective against Khabib, who's diving at his legs and is a constantly chain wrestle. The first or second takedowns most likely are not going to land, but could he defend the third and fourth takedowns? And at some point, would Ilya gas out by constantly exploding for counter shots and defending the chain wrestling of Khabib? Khabib also has very good reflexes in the striking, where he lacks the technique to get away from shots. He does have good reflexes to get his head away from those punches. Now, if Khabib is not able to pressure Ilya, I think Ilya knocks him out. And that's the thing about Khabib. We have seen fights before where he was not the one pressuring at the beginning of the fight, where he was the one moving away, like against Ali Aquenta in the first round against Aya Quinta. Aya Quinta was the one pressuring Habib. Conor did the same thing in the first round before the first takedown. Ilya has something there that he can work with, if he could be the assertive one. The more marketable fighter would be Zhang Ming. He's a light heavyweight Naka artist. Chinese fighter, if the UFC is still wanted to expand their empire over there. He could be the best, like next star for them to build up on the MSG future prelim fight. So I would say for the sport, I would put Lonnie Kavanaugh there. For the business side, I would put Gene Mung, and there with Hawk Rock. Why does John Jones get a pass and is widely regarded as the GOAT when he's been caught popping multiple times? But any other athlete in any other sport gets seemingly shadow banned from the sport when they get caught. And do you know what's even crazier about that? In this sport of MMA, doing steroids is even more dangerous than most other sports, right? Taking steroids in baseball is not nearly as dangerous to the athletes. Let's say, for an example, a roided-fueled John Jones could smash his opponent with ground pound and change them permanently. And then we look at baseball. They're trying to hit a ball out of the arena. Or in basketball, they're trying to shoot the ball into the basket. It's very different. But in those sports, if they do steroids, they don't get regarded as the GOAT. But in this sport, they would actually move the fight to a different state. Just for the guy who tested positive for steroids could fight under another commission. The standard is not the same for MMA with the other sports. And the thing is, John Jones didn't test positive once. John Jones tested positive 3 times, and that's not including the cocaine. And crazy enough, 2 of those are against Daniel Cormier, and the other one, Alexander Gussin. Both those guys were his rivals. So in 2015, when he fought Daniel Cormier the first time, he tested positive for cocaine metabolites. 2016 for UFC 200, which is one of the biggest UFC events of all time. Jones tested positive for clomiphene and let boost testosterone. USADA later said that it was a contaminated supplement. So Jones only had a 1-year suspension. Then he gets scheduled to fight Daniel Cormier again, a few months after his suspension was up, and tested positive for Tylenol, which is an anabolic steroid. That win became a no contest. He was stripped of his title and had a 15-month suspension. A month after that suspension was up, he went up against Alexander Gussin and yet again tested positive for Tylenol. And that was the whole pulsing effect and moved the fight from Las Vegas to Los Angeles because it was a different commission. For any other sport, A fighter who failed 3 times would never be looked at as the greatest of their sport ever. Why isn't Barry Bonds considered the greatest baseball player of all time? Jon Jones is essentially the Barry Bonds of MMA, where Jon Jones is considered the GOAT. But Barry Bonds isn't for baseball. Because, statistically, the skill, and as just a player, Barry Bonds is the best baseball player that has ever existed. He has the most home runs in history, the most MVP awards than any baseball player, even including Babe Ruth, than all the other greats. The only reason Barry Bonds is not considered the GOAT was because of the steroids. So now, everybody says, it's Babe Ruth, it's Willie Mays, it's Hank Aaron. Nobody even mentions Barry Bonds, unless with an asterisk. And I think the same thing should be with Jon Jones. We can say Jones, the best fighter we've ever seen in the octagon. But we can't say he's the greatest of all time. In my opinion, the greatest of all time is George S. Pierre. Why is a standard for MMA that low that we can consider Jones the GOAT, but not other cheats from other sports as GOATs, right? Why do we have such a low standard for this sport? Appreciate the skills that he brings to the octagon and how good of a fighter he was. But to be the greatest fighter of all time, which is a representative of the sport. The GOATs of the sport are who represents those sports. When casual fans think of sports, the first question they ask is, who is the greatest? When people think about basketball, who's the first guy they think of? Michael Jordan. When I think of football, I think of Messi. I think of Cristiano Ronaldo. I think of Madonna. When I think of the sport of track and field, I think of Usain Bolt. Right. I'm a casual fan of a lot of these different sports. And I can imagine it's the same way casual fans look at MMA. When they think of MMA, who is the first fighter they think of? Maybe for this sport, it's Conor McGregor because he's the most famous. But they also think of Jon Jones because of how the UFC promoted him as the GOAT. And I don't think it's the best thing. Not only for the sport, but for the UFC specifically. Because once these casual fans start to understand that Jon Jones tested positive in multiple fights, it changes the whole dynamic. And now they start to think, like, why are they promoting him as the GOAT when he did steroids multiple times, right? So that's why I think some of these other legends should be the face of MMA. I think GSP, there's nobody else better to represent the sport than George Pierre. So, excellent question, man. They would have Charlie Rousseau if Max Holloway had a normal reach for his size. Could he become the featherweight GOAT? If not, what reach would he have needed? Or was the problem something else? Yeah, it was something else. If you gave Max Holloway a longer reach, he would have fought differently. I think the main thing about Max Holloway was that he wasn't as powerful. He didn't have the same punching power as some of the other featherweights. But when you give certain skills to fighters, you also take away some of the stuff that they already work with. So by giving Max Holloway a longer reach, I think he would strike differently, right? He wouldn't be the same fighter that he is. Or, if he gave like Ilia Topuria a longer reach, he probably would not be the same fighter in the pocket. He would be throwing a lot more jabs and strikes from long distance, perhaps similar to the way that Volkanovski does, right? Because Volk has a long reach, so those jabs are emphasized in his style. He has some of the best jabs we've ever seen. And it's usually the same for a lot of fighters who have a long reach. Their jabs and straights tend to be a lot more focused on, if not just better. Now, Max does have a good jab, and he has a short reach, but he uses it very differently. He uses it to set up his combinations, and it's different than some of the other best jabs in the UFC, like GSP, Gage Mousasi, Kamaru Usman, Alexander Volkanovski. Allow those fighters throw jabs in single numbers. Not to set up combinations as much, but almost like pot-shotting with that jab. Max could do the same thing, but he uses a lot more to set up his combos, where he uses it to get in closer range, so then he can volume punch. So, I wouldn't say there's anything you can give to Max Holloway that wouldn't take away from his style. Perhaps as the punching power, but even at that, he would probably fight differently if he had that like Ilia type of power. Or if you gave him better wrestling, or something like that. A lot of those things would make him a better fighter, I would say, but it would change how he normally fights. So, the only way I could see Max Holloway being the featherweight GOAT, which would mean he would beat Volkanovski in those 3 fights. I think the only thing is if you gave him more punching power. Then he could specifically beat Volk, because Volk didn't have the best chin, and he tends to get hit when he's retreating away from his opponent. So, that would be the best addition to Max Holloway. So, that's the end of the episode, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to give the video a like. Make sure to subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications. Excellent questions. And the next episode is going to be next week. And if you guys have any questions, it's going to be in the community tab. Leave your questions there. And I'll see you guys in the next